To recap, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles My Life as a Dark Lord is the first Final Fantasy game I've played in the entire franchise. This game was received positively for attempting to do something different from traditional Final Fantasy games despite its lack of depth. One could say it's why I gravitated towards Final Fantasy XIII in the first place. While the gameplay and story never come together, at least not in a clean way, the presentation was stellar, and the mythos was intriguing enough to see where future games in this Fabula Nova Crystallis series would take it to. There is a confession I have to make. Final Fantasy XIII isn't my first mainline Final Fantasy game. In fact, this was the second game I played in the mainline series. Wait, so if My Life as a Dark Lord was your first Final Fantasy game, and Final Fantasy XIII was your second mainline series game, then what was your first? Well, on January 24th, 2014, my first mainline Final Fantasy game I've ever played was Final Fantasy XIII-2. I'm just dropping bombshells from left to right, aren't I? All of that time, of all the mainline Final Fantasy games in the franchise, I started with this, a direct sequel to a mainline Final Fantasy game. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't pinpoint exactly why I gravitated to the sequel first rather than 13. Maybe it's the advertising, maybe it's my fascination with time travel stories, maybe it's because I like to work backwards, much like how I played Max Payne 3 first, then the first game. Nevertheless, replaying XIII-2 for this video has been nothing short of an interesting experience. Unlike prior reviews, I will approach this game as someone who has played it before and find out if my sentiments has changed. Did my experience with Final Fantasy XIII change my opinion towards XIII-2? Do I still think it's a great game? The answer is yes, but the reasons for that answer are different compared to when I first played it. This time, with over 70 hours of 13 under my belt, let's examine why Final Fantasy XIII-2 is my favorite in the 13 series. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is a direct sequel to Final Fantasy XIII. The game received positive reception and was seen as a functionally superior version of its predecessor. This was my proper introduction to the Final Fantasy franchise, and I remember enjoying the game when I first played it all of those years ago. Playing XIII-2 for this video has put my initial opinion in perspective after playing a multitude of RPGs of varying quality, especially coming off the heels of 13. For this video, I will go into detail about what has changed between these two games, because there are some strong opinions regarding the changes and additions made for the sequel I must express. A lot of them positive, and a bunch of them constructive, to put it nicely. Without further delay, let's talk about presentation. Regardless of how people felt about Final Fantasy XIII, there's no denying the overall presentation was nothing short of magnificent. The music was well orchestrated, the graphics for the time could rival some 8th generation games, and the cinematic cutscenes were outstanding. There was only one problem. Final Fantasy XIII on Xbox 360, the version I played, came in 3 discs. The developers saw this as a hurdle to jump over, so the only way to reduce the file size from 30 gigs to about 7 across all platforms is to take a few steps back from the presentation. Graphics are scaled back, though not as noticeable compared to the significantly reduced amount of pre-rendered cutscenes. Only a handful of them exist, the beginning and the end of the game. In place of the beautiful pre-rendered cutscenes are gameplay cutscenes, and while I don't think they are terrible, it does take players out of the experience when things like this happen. Just so we're clear, I'm not doing this on purpose. This is simply a common occurrence that takes players from the mood. It's so common, in fact, it's not a matter of how many of these moments I can stuff in a single video, it's a matter of which scenes can I use to prove my point. What I will say, however, is the character models are detailed enough to justify using gameplay cutscenes rather than pre-rendered cutscenes, for the most part. Areas from the first game are reused for the sequel with little to no change. This isn't to say that this is out of laziness, as this game's theme revolves around traveling through time, space, and alternate realities. Truth be told, it would be strange if a game that focuses on themes like this did not reuse areas, characters, and enemies. My stance is this: if a developer can reuse assets that make sense to the game's narrative without having the players experience deja vu, not only should that practice be encouraged, but it should be commended. Lord knows how many games I've played that contain levels with copy-paste rooms to the point of insanity. With that said, there's no doubt in my mind that a majority of these assets came from the first game. The Sunlit Waterscape, Yasha's Massif, Arclight Steppe, the Vile Peaks, and Erba all return from Final Fantasy XIII with some variation for narrative significance. And while XIII-2 introduces locations made for this game, they have their fair share of issues. Brescia Ruins, The Dying World, Academia, Serendipity, Augusta Tower, and Bodum. Oh, I'm sorry, New Bodum are all new worlds for players to explore. But upon further analysis, they feel eerily similar for the wrong reasons. The Dying World is the beginning section of Erba, but worse. Serendipity is Nautilus, but scaled back. Augusta Tower feels like a mashup of multiple futuristic areas from the first game, but admittedly done a little more effectively compared to others, with the exception of one section which I like to call Motion Sickness Hell. Brescia Ruins isn't what I call bad, but it's not visually stimulating. And while one can make the argument that creating New Bodum from a narrative perspective makes sense, is it really necessary to make the location have a similar layout as the old Bodum, even down to the freaking pier? At least it has a larger section to explore, otherwise I would cry, copy-paste job! And Academia, in my opinion, is the worst world in the game for many reasons. In fact, I would go as far to say that most of the problems XIII-2 has can be traced back to this world and its alternate timeline. So I'm sorry in advance if I go back and forth to Academia to address them. Fortunately, my issues with this level's presentation is the weakest of the three main points, so I won't comment on them for too long. While the city looks beautiful in 400 AF thanks in part to its lighting and rain effects, it's not something I haven't seen before. It's essentially every single future city that has existed since Blade Runner. Academia may be new to the series, but it's certainly an unimaginative location. Masashi Hamauzu has done excellent work with the first game's composition. For the sequel, the director Motomu Toriyama decided that the sequel's composition should contain more variety in comparison to Final Fantasy XIII. To accomplish this feat, 2 more composers were added to the team, which includes Naoshi Mizuta and Misato Suzuki. The latter worked as a sound director for several Square Enix games whose specialty is electronic music, while the former has experience working on instrumental pieces who got to start on a handful of Capcom games before moving to Square Enix in the late 90s to work on games like Final Fantasy XI. The Final Fantasy XIII series follows a particular melody and theme for all of the games, even sharing some tracks across all 3 games. And when I say they reuse tracks, I really mean that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing since I already love some of these pieces, but it does get a little annoying after a while. But what about the new compositions, the ones made specifically for Final Fantasy XIII-2? Well, there are still some orchestral pieces here and there, but a majority of the compositions that occupy the game are those that blend the traditional and electronic instruments into one.
To see smiley faces, this hope, part of chaos cannot take, paradoxes must break, this is the path I must take.
For certain pieces, they can carry just as much emotional weight as the first game. Let's take Erba, one of the returning worlds for the first game, as an example. The theme for this area in Final Fantasy XIII is undeniably a beautiful piece that carries a solemn, somber tone when traversing what's left of Fang of Vanille's hometown after being away for centuries. It's a powerful piece that carries emotional significance. Now, let's compare that to what XIII-2 opted for in its own version of Erba.
The prophecies foretell us of the end. It doesn't mean that we have to believe that.
It sounds like the original, but is clearly done in a different style, replacing a piece that invokes melancholy. It's a pop song that carries a bit of weight and relevance for the story through its lyrics.
Oh, cursed fate, eternally delivering your doom. But no true hope is born. My
Beauty comes in different shapes and sizes, and this song is proof of this statement. Much like Banjo-Kazooie and the Killer Instinct reboot, Final Fantasy XIII-2's music arrangement is transformative, but has the unfortunate luck of not being as frequently played as the world themes. Remember the new piece for Erba? There's a second version that plays when encountering enemies, but before engaging in combat.
Just as the light begins to fade to dark, the moaning wind sings songs to my forebodings. Am
I don't normally say this, but this beat slaps. It's so good, I intentionally don't attack enemies just to hear it for more than 5 seconds. It's not to say that I hate to listen to the battle theme for the game, because it sounds great. I mean, it's not 13's battle theme, but I dig it. Unfortunately, the other new compositions are hit and miss, and it stems from the variety initiative from the director. Make no mistake, these brand new songs are a joy to listen to, and the variety is appreciated. But as a consequence, there isn't a defined style XIII-2 adopts. Yes, there are pieces where it follows a pattern of traditional and electronic music blended into one, but there are those where that blueprint isn't always consistent. They're not terrible, but it sounds less like Final Fantasy and more like Final Fantasy XIII-2 featuring music from the Devil May Cry series. It simply doesn't mesh well in-game compared to the rest of the soundtrack. While the visual department took a big hit due to constraints of the 360's lack of a Blu-ray player and some assets were carried over from the first game, the overall presentation for XIII-2 was, in my opinion, carried by the music. It's not a perfect soundtrack by any stretch of the meaning, but it's not an exaggeration to say the new pieces help elevate locations and situations immensely. There are some changes I would make regarding the arrangement of said music, but as it is, it's acceptable. What's presented is a decent at best attempt at presentation with a quality soundtrack. Gameplay in Final Fantasy XIII is a component that I both love and hate. While the paradigm system leads to creativity and flexibility, traversal is strictly limited to traveling in a straight line with little to no interactivity. As someone who played XIII-2 first, then the first game, I had an idea going into this game that there would be major to minor improvements across the board. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, nearly all of the gameplay problems found in the first game were fixed and expanded. While the paradigm system is carried over from the last game, there have been adjustments to make the combat flow better. For example, the Sentinel role has been buffed to include a defense bonus when characters switch to that role, meaning that having all 3 party members fulfill the Sentinel role is a viable option. Speaking of roles, every time the characters switch roles for the first time in 13, the game has the tendency to show this animation one by one. It's fine for the first few times, but in practice, it slows down the combat. Stop showing me Vanille's peppy dance for the 500th time, game! I want to heal my party, damn it! Thankfully, this is removed in the sequel. Instead of a named character fulfilling the 3rd slot, monsters you find in the world can be a party member, and just like Sarah and Noel, players can enhance them throughout their own Crystarium. All of the monsters fulfill only one role, but the added advantage is that players will be able to select up to 3 different monsters to fight alongside them. In a way, it's kind of like Pokemon, where you battle and collect all the monsters and they aid you in battle. You can rename your monster and even add fun accessories like hats and backpacks. I could do without this feature, but I'm not opposed to the idea of a layer of personalization. In the first game, when the party leader dies, the game is over. Do you know what happens when the character you control dies during combat? You switch over to the second character. Thank God. Not only does this fix a fatal flaw for me in Final Fantasy XIII, it makes sense from a narrative standpoint. Since both Sarah and Noel are working towards the same goal together, it's a good decision to make it so if one falls, the other can take over temporarily. The Crystarium system found in the previous game is back, but with a few adjustments to better complement the level up system. Like before, players will invest points to gain better stats, but the difference is, instead of gaining bonus stats like an extra ATB gauge or accessory points in certain roles, all bonuses can be obtained provided that players fill up the character's Crystarium. But that's not all of the changes, minor or otherwise, made to the gameplay. There are more minigames to play, there are 2 variants of chocobos to ride after a certain point in the world story, and the player can save at any time instead of relying on a station. I can name loads of other small fixes and quality of life changes the developers made to the gameplay experience, but we could be here for a long time, and the video is already long enough as it is. My point regarding all of this is, I have a deep appreciation for the developers for not only fixing the problems of Final Fantasy XIII, but also enhancing and adding new things. Traversal in Final Fantasy XIII was a negative I have listed in my review. Regardless of intent from a story or gameplay perspective, all this linear gameplay does is discourage exploration and discovery. I get it, the developers don't want players to get lost in the main story from following side quests or for some silly reason. Thing is, Final Fantasy VII, hell, any RPG for that matter, had linear sections at a fraction of 13's linear section and were able to let the player do what they want in the world, whether it's interacting with NPCs, completing side quests, or taking in the sights. Time travel plays a major role in Final Fantasy XIII too, so there needs to be a system where players can travel from one point in time to another that is easy to follow. Enter the Historia Crux. This is the method of traversing from one level to another. In order to progress further in the game, players must find artifacts and bring them to these gates. There are 2 different types of gates to open up, and effectively 2 different artifact types to get. One opens story relevant worlds, which players can get artifacts for after defeating a boss or if a story specific quest is finished. The other type can only be opened with wild artifacts found in the world, but typically lead to optional side stories. After certain points, players can replay old worlds by closing gates, incidentally starting from the beginning of the level, so they can reach for a better score for QTE sections, make different dialogue options, or in my case, re-record a specific part of the game because the previous recording was corrupted. Talk about convenience. The Historia Crux is not a perfect system, but it beats walking to the location using some magical item that manipulates time. The level design is a much needed breath of fresh air. It feels like I can stretch my arms and legs without accidentally hitting an invisible wall. Exploration is encouraged as Mog comes equipped with powers that reveal hidden items and can be thrown towards hard to reach places. With that said, it's not perfect. A dying world has an open level design, but there is little to nothing to do other than encountering enemies randomly. But hang on a moment. Didn't you say a few minutes ago that your problem with 13 was the ridiculously compact level design, and now that there's a giant open level to explore, all of a sudden it's bad? Yes, because there is a right way and a wrong way to create an open area like this. If your giant open world has little to nothing to do other than defeating random enemies all the time, it won't be a fun time, it'll simply be an obstacle course to get through. On the flip side, Academia is reminiscent of the corridor-like level design found in Final Fantasy XIII, which would be okay for a megatropolis like this, but in practice, it is absolutely annoying and sometimes bewildering to get from point A to point B. Here, all I want to do is get to the northern part of the city and continue the story, but in order to do so, I can't just take the moving escalator straight there. I need to get to the right side of the city, get to the small pathway that gets me out of the right side, and even at that point, when the academy is at full display, I gotta cross the bridge to the other side and take the ramp that leads to another bridge, and then I arrive at my destination. Okay, there's a shorter path to get to the academy if you use this route, but I had to learn it after the fact. Even when you use the map, it's a mess of lines and dead ends, so forgive me if I didn't catch on the first time around. If that was my only issue with Academia, I wouldn't be as heated as I am now. But unfortunately, it gets worse when you start throwing in forced encounters like an Academia 400 AF. This is the biggest pain in the ass, and it highlights how terrible encounters work in this game. If traversing the alternate Academia felt like hell, then Academia 400 AF is absolute torture. Imagine attempting to travel from point A to point B and get swamped with monsters every 5 seconds. What should have been a 30-minute destination turned into an hour-long gauntlet filled with enemies that run after you, and even when there are no enemies within the vicinity, the engagement will occur, so you have no choice but to fight. Once this world is complete, things go back to normal, right? There won't be any more enemies to fight? Ha! Don't make me laugh. Of course there will be more enemies waiting for your return, if you choose to enter this time gate or looking for this graviton core, which we'll discuss in the next section because that's a completely different problem of its own. Don't worry guys, Academia will return. In my Final Fantasy XIII review, I mentioned how lifeless it felt traversing through Cocoon and Grand Pulse due to a lack of interactivity with NPCs and towns. It didn't matter to me how beautiful the environments were, it would mean nothing if there wasn't any activity going on. For this iteration, there are plenty of NPCs to talk to. A majority of the characters serve as world building for the level, while others offer side quests to take on in the form of missions. The missions you receive from NPCs are a mix of defeating certain enemies, partaking in minigames to fix an anomaly, fetch quests, and... Actually, a majority of the NPC missions are fetch quest based now that I think about it hard enough. While I appreciate the fact that there are plenty of things to do aside from the main story, the side quests leave so much to be desired. The overall gameplay for XIII-2 feels like an evolution of what 13 attempted to accomplish, only this time with much better results. It's made very clear that the developers put more focus on the gameplay aspect of the sequel, rather than the presentation. The combat is refined, traversal and exploration is a liberating experience when it's done correctly, and the game feels more livelier with the addition of NPC interactivity. Well, interactivity as deep as the puddle, but it's an improvement compared to 13. This is a stark contrast from when I first played XIII-2. Back then, I only thought that the gameplay was only okay. Not the best, but not the worst either. Today, I believe the best part of XIII-2 is the gameplay. Okay, so far the presentation is good at best and disappointing at worst, and the gameplay, while not phenomenal, offers a fun experience. Surely the story must be as good as I remembered it, right? Okay, why don't you have a seat here? In Final Fantasy XIII, Lightning set off on a quest to save her sister, bring down Barthandelus, and defy fate alongside a cast of characters who have their own life problems. Immediately after the events of the first game, Lightning was whisked away by a mysterious, shadowy force and transported to a different time and different place. Valhalla, 700 years in the future. XIII-2 sees Lightning battle against a brand new antagonist, Caius, who wants nothing more than to create a paradox big enough to save the Cirrus he was tasked to protect, Yule. The character motivations behind Caius' actions aren't unique, but it does propose an interesting question. How far are you willing to go in order to save the one person you've known your entire lifetime? As for Lightning, she understands how it feels to lose someone you held dear, so she can relate to what the main antagonist is going through. The character dynamic between characters going through loss could be effective had the entire story revolved around Lightning and Caius. Except, you're not playing as Lightning, despite the fact that you play as her in the first 10 minutes and she's on the front of the freaking box. No. You're playing as newcomer Noel and Lightning's little sister, Sarah. Wait, who? Yeah, you know, the girl who turns into crystal and disappears for a majority of the first game's runtime, only appearing during flashbacks and occasionally mentioned by name to remind the audience that she exists? Let that be the oh-so-strong impression she left in 13. In fairness, there isn't much to dissect from her when she serves as the damsel in distress for most of the game, a character for Lightning and Snow to chase after. Fun fact, her role in the first game was supposed to be bigger to the point of being a playable character. Due to time constraints, however, that idea was scrapped. Now that Sarah finally gets to star in her own game, what do I think of her? Is she more fleshed out enough to be a great character? Kind of? In the first game, she only appears sporadically throughout the 70-hour adventure, so there wasn't enough time to know much about Sarah outside of being in love with Snow, loving her sister Lightning, and being a nice, kind person to others. That's all I got out of her, at least. In XIII-2, since she's the main character, Sarah is given an opportunity to become more than a pretty face to look at. I must admit, however, that it's difficult to like a character like Sarah who has the personality of a cardboard box. And no, her outfit isn't doing her any favors. It doesn't really help that it's possibly Lightning who gave Sarah that new outfit. Who the hell thought this was a good idea? It's not even an issue with her voice actors because I know that Laura Bailey can do fantastic performances in other games. I believe it's the writing that made her this way. With that said, we are given more time to develop Sarah's character beyond being a goody two-shoes archetype. While not as cold-hearted as her sister, she does become wary of simply accepting things at face value as the story progresses. In some cases, she takes the initiative when push comes to shove. While she's not like Lightning, I'm lying if I said she didn't turn out to be a stronger character by the end of the game. The same cannot be said for Sarah's other half, Noel. Look, I actually dig his character design, as is reminiscent of Vanille and Fang's outfit, implying that he's a native or a descendant of Grand Pulse natives. But once again, much like Sarah, Noel's personality isn't the most interesting about him, but his backstory is somewhat intriguing. Noel is a person who came from a bleak future and is tasked to protect Yule alongside Caius. He was meant to take Caius' place by killing him, but Noel refused to do so as he believes this isn't what Yule wants. Before he has the chance to confront Caius about this matter, he disappears, and Yule dies in Noel's arms. After leaving the world he once knew as his home, Noel is whisked away by a shining light and was summoned by Lightning to have him help Sarah on a journey to stop Caius' plans to create a paradox large enough to destroy the world. This sounds kinda cool, but unfortunately doesn't have a personality that excites. Although his relationship with Sarah is kind of adorable when the game allows for the two to converse with each other. Dare I say, the chemistry between Noel and Sarah feel more believable than Sarah's relationship with Snow, and she's married to the guy. To be fair, the latter's relationship wasn't given enough screen time in comparison to the former's. And that's all the main protagonist for 13-2. Well, I mean there's Mog, but I see him as a side character rather than a main character. Speaking of which, what about the other characters? The side characters that aid on Sarah and Noel's journey. All the main cast from the first game fulfill the supporting role. Snow left Sarah to search for Lightning in a distant future. Vanille and Fang make an appearance as Force Ghosts as their real bodies are under crystal stasis at the base of Cocoon. And Hope is a...
It's been a while, Sarah.
Hope? Is that you?
I'm grateful you remember me.
Who's this?
Oh,
Director of Academy Research, Team Alpha. Hope Estime at your service.
That is Hope? Okay, maybe in retrospect it isn't that big of a deal, given that Hope throughout 13 has changed from a cowardly boy to a man of action, so this character evolution is the logical path to take. No complaints, just marveling at that glow up. Out of all of the original cast, Saz feels like an out-of-nowhere inclusion. The first time you encounter him, which is near the end of the game, felt less like a normal interaction and more like reading his stats out of a baseball card.
Hey there, Sarah. What's happening? Wait a minute. You know what? Forget I asked. Can't hear a single word you say from you. How you been? Keeping yourself busy? Not running around like a headless chocobo, I hope. You know, you need to stop and take a breath every now and then, or you just wipe yourself out. I remember being here back in the day. You know, when I was young and in my prime. Things heated up between me and Lightning, and we ended up going our separate ways. Well, to tell you the truth, she walked off and left me behind. Man, those were some tough times. If you're in a bad situation with friends, someone's got your back. If you're alone, you're done for. Speaking of tough times, things still haven't gotten much better. I wandered into this strange, psychedelic world, and now I'm gambling to win the prize of a lifetime. I've got something important on the line, and you know I'm not one to back down. I know I can get out of this winner. I have to. Well, I just wanted to drop in and say hi. Play nice with your friends, you hear me? Oh, and here's a little something from me to you. But now I really gotta run. Later, folks.
What the hell is that?
Is this supposed to be Saz? Sounds and looks more like an animatronic. At least in the last game, it felt like he had a purpose in the main story.
If I was right about his focus, he's probably a crystal already. Of course, if he was supposed to take out that thing's l'Cie, then either we die, or he's a Sith.
die? Really?
It's a pickle, all right.
Here, it's like the devs only had time to record the voice actor's lines for only 10 minutes. Damn, Saz. They did you dirty. And then there's this character, newly introduced to this game, who serves as the game's shopkeeper.
Chocobocolina! Welcome, get your traveling products here at Chocolina's Emporium. The beauty's all mine, but the products can be yours, but only if you show me the money.
She's not important, and her outfit leaves little to the imagination, but she has more of a personality than the two main leads.
Have you seen that big old giant? Where'd he come from? Someone sure wasted their time and hard-earned money making something that big. I don't like seeing materials go to waste like that, but hey, what can I do? I can open up my shop. That's what I can do.
My train of thought is finished. I've already given my 2 cents about Kais in the beginning of this section, but how do I feel about him as a main antagonist as a whole? At first, I couldn't take him seriously because of his getup. The only way his outfit could scream "I'm the villain" any louder would be if he had a curly mustache and an eye patch. He looks like a parody of a villain. Even his dialogue sounds like lyrics to a 2000s emo band.
I shall remember your pain. It will be carved in my heart, together with the memories of every other Yule, cursed to die this way.
After taking a breather from the comedy routine and attempting to take him seriously, he is a one-note character with some level of complexity. There is hidden potential to be found that could make him a well-written villain, but that's the thing. I can only talk about what could have happened instead of what actually happens. What we have here is a semi-forgettable villain. I made pacing a talking point for the first game for a reason. Well-intended or not, the linearity of 13 hurt the game's pacing as certain chapters drag on for longer than necessary, and the game is not truly starting until the final third. In 13-2, it's decently paced. The entire game plays out like a TV series with episode names and the story so far bumpers that play after loading a save file. The only thing that denotes which episode is which would be whenever players travel to a brand new world represented by flying see-through text and Lightning's narration.
We sometimes fall into the past as we gaze upon events that cannot be changed. Our hearts grow bitter with regret. And you, my dear Sarah, will you encounter your past here? How will you choose to deal with that pain?
If you only stick with playing through the story, 13-2 can last at least 30 hours, but completionists can still expect to finish the entire game around 50 hours if they know what to do. Compared to 13, this is on the shorter side of typical RPGs, but I make the argument that this should be considered a positive rather than a negative. With the exception of optional side stories, the story gets to the point without unnecessary filler in between the main plot points. Sometimes. Remember Noel's backstory from a few minutes ago? How long did that take me to explain? About a minute or so? Why the hell is this game dedicating an entire level to play through one that involves seeing his backstory? Show don't tell, yes, but if you told us this backstory before, why are you showing the audience what they already know? All it does is fill up the runtime. There's even a section where you're doing nothing but chasing after Noel through the empty world as he monologues to himself. Oh, but don't worry. Our good friend Academia makes sure that the pace of the story comes to a screeching halt. I've already talked about the 400 AF version and its horrific enemy placement, but I've yet to talk about how the alternate Academia greatly hurt 13-2's pacing. After reaching the Academy several years later, Hope devises a plan to lift a brand new version of Cocoon, but in order to do so, he must require the help of Sarah and Noel to travel across time and find 5 of the 7 Graviton cores hidden in the game. You know what that means? It's time to... Okay, whoever was the person who had the bright idea of adding this narrative roadblock, I only have one thing to ask you.
What were you thinking?
Unless you've been unconsciously collecting these invisible items by accident, you'd need to go back to previously visited worlds and find them. For certain worlds like Erba 400 AF, you need 2 wild artifacts in order to reach that Graviton core. If players use these wild artifacts on other gates that don't contain these cores, they could be screwing themselves and potentially locking them out of the rest of the game unless you get lucky in Serendipity or dealing with hard as hell minigames. Even when the game tells you where these cores are, it's not made clear where they really are. Alright, seems obvious. Okay, I might have an idea what this is.
Do you have the slightest idea how little that narrows it down?
Unless you've been using a guide to complete this quest like me, I regret nothing. Expect to waste hours playing scavenger hunts. Once you do eventually complete this unnecessary roadblock, the story proceeds to the final stretch of the game. Throughout 13-2, Sarah has gained a power that enables her to see visions of the future. One of the new characters, Yule, explains later on that this power can only be possessed by seeresses like herself, and it's both a blessing and a curse. Each time the future is changed, this power is used. Every time this power is used, the seeress's lifespan is cut. Aware of the risks imposed, Sarah is willing to sacrifice herself if it means that the future can be saved. After defeating Caius multiple times in multiple phases, a staple in Final Fantasy games, Caius is killed by Noel's hands, willingly or not. Once the pair return to Academia in 500 AF, they have a small celebration until Sarah receives one final vision of the future before dying in Noel's arms. And then there's the plot twist.
The heart of chaos beats in my chest. A manifestation of Etro. Should this heart stop beating, the goddess will die once again.
I killed the goddess?
Caius wins in the end, and a huge paradox has been unleashed in the world. It's explained that the villain carries the soul of Etro in his heart, and once his heart stops beating, so too will Etro cease to exist. This was the ending that made me believe Final Fantasy XIII-2's story was great. Unlike traditional RPGs, it doesn't have a happy ending where the good guys win in the end. The villain was smart enough to win, regardless if he lives or dies. Now, I can't talk about what should have happened as mentioned before, so let's only focus on what's presented in the final product. I went back and forth with how I felt as I was writing the script for this video. It's tough to determine if this twist ending makes up for the rest of the story elements, such as the handling of certain characters and the pacing near the end of the game. And then I asked myself, without mentioning other games I've played before and after, did I enjoy the story of XIII-2 more than 13? Final Fantasy XIII's story has problems of its own, such as a linearity hurting the pacing and the gameplay experience as a whole. There's no doubt in my mind that some of these characters in the first game are a pain in the ass to deal with. But I'm lying if I said I didn't enjoy the character dynamic between these characters. When I think back to 13, I remember Vanille's hesitation towards Sazh, Hope's confrontation against Snow, and Lightning's cold demeanor melting away as she gets to know the people around her. Through thick and thin, they grew to accept each other and work as a team. It may not be the best story written, or the most original, for that matter, but it's the one I'll always remember. XIII-2's story is not bad, but I won't remember it as fondly compared to its predecessor. Just because an ending is great, doesn't mean the unpaved road to get there is forgiven. If this was all Final Fantasy XIII-2 had to offer, I would have concluded this review as an underwhelming game once I took off the rose-tinted glasses. Unlike before, there's an opportunity to make things right. If you look at the back of the box for Final Fantasy XIII, you'll see a small indicator regarding game content downloads, meaning that DLC was planned for this game. While there were plans to add content like a new explorable area, new enemies, and new weapons, the plans were scrapped. The developers would revisit this idea with a sequel by adding a variety of DLC such as new costumes, new enemies, and most importantly, new story missions. For this section, I will solely focus on the latter since the rest doesn't pertain to the overall story. I mean, what can I say regarding the swimsuits, the Idol crossover outfit, and Mass Effect and Assassin's Creed outfits? You know what? Maybe that crossover with Final Fantasy XV makes more sense now. The first of the bunch is called Sazh, Heads or Tails, which focuses on the title character returning from Final Fantasy XIII, trapped in serendipity playing casino games. There is no combat involved, only playing casino games like poker, slot machines, and a fairly unique game called Chronobind. I don't really need to talk about games like the first two because they're self-explanatory. I mean, poker's poker, and slot machines are slot machines. In other news, when it rains, it's wet. Chronobind, on the other hand, appears daunting. At first glance, it looks like a cracked out version of roulette and poker. I'll attempt to explain how this game works to the best of my ability because, trust me, there is a lot going on. Chronobind is played with a standard deck of cards and a clock in the middle of the table. All players will set a bet amount in increments of 60, 600, or 6,000 chips, depending on the buy-in amount, and draw cards until they have a total of 5 on their hand. Play starts after the dealer draws and plays a card from the deck and turns the clock to the corresponding value. In this case, jacks are 11, queens are 12, kings are 13, aces are 1s, and the rest of the cards are dependent on their face value. After which, players will start selecting cards to play. The object of the game is to either match the value of the clock or have the highest value card on your hand. All players reveal their cards, and the victor goes to the player with the matching value or the highest value. This is where special rules comes to play. If 2 or more players play the same value card, a tie occurs. As mentioned before, an ace has a value of 1, but if another player plays the matching card or a king, the ace acts as a trap and automatically wins, unless another player plays another ace, which will result in a tie, or if there are no kings in play. Once the results are made, the game shifts to the clock phase. The winner of the match will control the direction of the clock based on the value used. The ideal way to win would be to move the clock back and forth on 13 in order to charge. Charging in this case refers to the bet amount raised. If the winner of the showdown played 2 or more cards of the same value, the charge is multiplied based on the number of cards used. If a tie occurred, then the charge amount depends on the number of matching cards used in the tie. After the clock is moved, all players will put down chips next to the value based on what cards were played. The first 3 phases repeat until the person controlling the clock lands on the bind, in which case the bind phase occurs. Next to the face values on the clock is a multiplier. This represents the amount the winner can potentially receive. The player who lands on the bind has the choice to clock out with the corresponding multiplier or continue the game. When I first started playing this casino game, I was dumbfounded by the complicated nature of a freaking clock determining the fate of the game. But after a few matches, I found it to be a joy to play. I became good enough to bankrupt another player by the end of the DLC. The overall objective isn't hard. Just collect an arbitrary amount of medals to complete the story, which should take at most an hour or at least half that amount if you know what you're doing. While the DLC isn't good, it does offer some story context for later in the game, and once finished, you can add Saz to the party as the 3rd character in place of a monster. The only downside to this DLC is that the additional minigames aren't added to the main campaign. DLC story only.
Disappointed!
But I think I understand why. Compared to other casino games, this requires skill in predicting what the AI will do. So theoretically, the grind to get more casino coins and cleaning out the prize table, if this particular mode is available in the main scenario, would be made easier. Kind of a shame, because I was curious about what Sarah or Noah will look like if they could emote like Saz after certain plays. Which brings us to the next DLC pack with Snow as the poster boy. Yeah, I won't lie to you, this was the DLC I wasn't able to complete. All the DLC amounts to is a glorified Coliseum battle, much like the other non-story related DLC. I tried different methods of cheesing against Snow, but my current party level and intellect isn't high enough to defeat Snow, and I'm not delaying this video any further than it needs to be. The footage you see on your screen was my attempt at battling Snow to show that I at least tried. And so brings us to the final piece of story DLC, Lightning, Requiem of the Goddess. Before I go any further, this DLC is spoiler heavy as it serves as the true ending of Final Fantasy XIII-2. This DLC is better played after you finish the main game. Requiem of the Goddess only contains 1 to 2 bosses depending on your performance, and once you defeat either one, the game's over. Sort of, but we'll discuss that later. What I want to discuss instead are the negatives I've encountered before speaking about positives. When you first drop in, it's not made perfectly clear what's going on. Lightning battles against the main antagonist, Caius, and after a short while sees a vision that shows Sarah's death at the end of the main scenario, after which Lightning teleports in front of Etro's throne and engages in what appears to be the final battle against Caius. After a tutorial explaining what to do in this DLC, the battle begins. But before I had the chance to learn the ropes, I died and went straight to this menu, where I can check on Lightning's stats, her abilities, and change the difficulty of the battle. Except I can't because this is the only option to take. With the way I explained things, it made it seem like that's all there was to the DLC, just a singular boss to beat and die to repeatedly. Under normal circumstances, I would bash this game for being a repetitive piece of content that locked away relevant story details behind a paywall, a practice that became commonplace at the time. But here's the thing, this DLC only lasts under 2 hours, and yet, this was the most fun I've had in Final Fantasy XIII-2 in comparison to the nearly 50 hours of playtime in the main scenario. Okay, but how? Let me put it this way. The con about the DLC being a repetitive boss battle is also a pro. I'm reminded of a quote from one of the developers behind Halo regarding making games fun.
If you can get 30 seconds of fun, you can pretty much stretch that out to be an entire game. You can have all the great graphics and all the different characters and lots of different weapons with amazing effects, but if you don't nail that 30 seconds, you're not going to have a great game.
This developer mindset works well with shooters like Halo, Call of Duty, and Gears of War, as combat engagements typically last between 15 to 30 seconds, especially in multiplayer, as matches are composed of multiple engagements for a set period. RPGs don't work that way. The main draw isn't only combat, but a combination of story, exploration, and role-playing. This requires long stretches of play sessions that typically last for days, even months at times, in order to fully enjoy an RPG. Final Fantasy XIII-2's gameplay elements are refined at best and a slog at worst. For every great gameplay moment, there are several more monotonous tasks to get through before jumping back to the good stuff. Worse yet are the roadblocks players have to get through in order to advance the story. Requiem of the Goddess only has combat, but the tools and mechanics provided by the game mode are better executed here than in the main scenario. Instead of having 6 different roles at your disposal, you're limited to 5 unique roles under 6 different names. There is no medic role, and the only way to heal is by using potions and lightning signature attack Legion of One. This limitation forces players to strategize and learn the boss's patterns at a faster pace than what the game tends to usually be. In fact, if players tackle this battle like any other engagement in the main scenario, they can expect to be defeated by Caius frequently. Did Caius switch to the commando role? Get that knight roll ready at any time to avoid heavy damage. Is he staggered? Launch his ass to space so he doesn't get the chance to do anything. Is he knocked to the ground? Now's the time to add a buff. Every time the player defeats Caius, Lightning levels up and gains an attack and health boost, and occasionally learns new moves and new roles, such as a Synergist role or a Saboteur role. With every successful run, Lightning becomes stronger. At a certain point, when Lightning defeats Caius fast enough, he will turn into a second form, Chaos Bahamut. Whereas gameplay in 13-2 felt formulaic by a 10-hour mark, the DLC takes it to heights so unimaginable, it can only be explained through the best possible visual medium. Every playthrough is a lesson in repetition. Make a mistake, you get brutally punished. Think 2 steps ahead of your AI opponent's mind and reap the rewards. This is what I call the ultimate test of skill, determination, and patience. This is what Final Fantasy XIII-2 should have been from the start. A refined, action-oriented take on the Final Fantasy XIII combat. And your reward for completing this mode is having Lightning join the party like Saz and Snow before, and watching the true ending to Final Fantasy XIII-2. I can't believe I'm saying this, but this is the first time I felt that the DLC is the best part of a game compared to the whole package. I don't just recommend buying Requiem of the Goddess, I'm making it mandatory to play. Not just for the story, but because it brings together everything great about the combat of 13-2. Overall, the story DLC is a huge hit and a miss, but it does depend on what you're looking for. Do you want to have a relaxing time and play casino games all day? Or do you want to test your skills in an ultimate battle? Either way, there is little to no regret to be had when choosing one over the other. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is essentially a better version of Final Fantasy XIII, but comes with more baggage to put up with in comparison. It's not as beautiful as what came before, and the story feels like wasted potential. But all of the gameplay enhancements and quality of life touches makes 13-2 a functionally better version of 13. And I believe that's the point of 13-2. It didn't seek out to become a well-written follow-up of what came before, it sought out to become a fun experience to play, first and foremost. When I first played Final Fantasy XIII-2 in 2014, I felt enamored with the story, characters, and its interpretation of time travel as someone who grew up with games like movies like Back to the Future and Blink's the Time Sweeper. Today, I fell in love again for a completely different reason. The gameplay. The combat is tighter and faster paced, and it's fun to explore without being restrained when levels take full advantage of this newfound freedom. 13-2 could have easily been a by-the-numbers sequel with little to no changes. The developers could have kept the startup paradigm shifts, the soullessness of the world, or the one death limit, but they didn't. I commend the developers in attempting to fix the problems of the last game and enhance what made 13 great to play. This isn't what I'd call one of the greatest Final Fantasy games of all time, but serving as a sequel to one of the most divisive games in franchise history. Before the other divisive game in the franchise, Final Fantasy XIII-2 is, in my opinion, the best of the 13 series by a small margin.